Welcome to the introductory chapter of Sustainable Living. I'm Dr. Sean Trivett. I'm an environmental sociologist, and I've spent many years researching, teaching, and thinking about the environmental and social problems that face us today. For a bit of context, I am based in East Tennessee in the United States of America, and most of the stuff I'm going to talk about is going to have a U.S. focus, but it's important to keep in mind that many of the concepts I'll be discussing actually transcend national boundaries. In this video, I'm going to provide an overview of some of the key problems and what are some of the things we should be thinking about as we try to address and resolve them. Keep in mind that there is a lot more I could say about almost every topic I'm going to touch on, but this is an introductory video, so I'm going to do my best not to get too lost in the weeds. And over time, I plan to create more content that will explore these topics and other related ones in much more depth. So, let's start by thinking about what are some of the key problems facing us today. We can sum up our current situation as consisting of three distinct yet interrelated problems. The first of those is physical. Climate change is causing increasingly frequent and severe disruptions in multiple aspects of life. Among other things, this is likely to cause significant challenges to the production and distribution of food. This is compounded by the concentration and consolidation of our food supply. The other two problems are both broadly social. Our political and economic practices are creating instability in society. The second major problem is that unbridled capitalism has been allowed to run amok. The deregulation of our economy has contributed to both increasing social inequality and widespread economic instability, such as supply disruptions, rising inflation, extreme recessions, and the like. And finally, democracy as an institution is being challenged and tested in ways not seen in the better part of a century. The last few years have seen authoritarian and fascist ideologies move from the fringes to mainstream political discourse. Cultural and institutional safeguards on our governmental institutions are being attacked, and in some cases unraveled. We now demonize not just political opponents, but entire groups of citizens. Gerrymandering distorts representative government for political gain. And lately, we've seen efforts to disenfranchise entire groups of people. Added to this, we are also seeing a long overdue reckoning with deep-rooted and long-standing inequalities in our society, especially along lines of race. Now, I personally think it's high time, past time even, to address these systems of oppression. But my point is that doing so can generate some instability. By itself, we could probably handle that. But intersect that with everything else, especially the rise in authoritarian ideology, with which it is very much linked, and we're sitting on a bit of a powder keg. So put all of these things together, and the takeaway is that we are living in increasingly uncertain times. I think that most people suspect this on some level, even if they can't quite put their finger on the reason, and some people are going to emphasize some aspects over others. We could possibly unpack that too. But what I want people to see is that whatever our political or religious ideology, whatever our cultural background, whatever labels or terms we use to identify ourselves, these problems impact all of us. We are all in this together. We all want to survive and thrive. This is not just what it is to be human, but what it is to be alive. Every living thing wants to thrive, though that can take a lot of different forms. That might mean growing and developing. That might mean feasting on whatever it is that nourishes us. That might mean creating something that will outlive us. Biologists often talk about an organism's drive to pass on its genetics, and that counts as something to outlive us. But I also think it's a little bit of a narrow focus. I mean, after all, plants and animals don't really have a concept of genetics. They're reproducing because it's in their nature to do that. But it's not the only thing that's in their nature. Anyway, all that to say, if we recognize that a central goal of all living things is to thrive, and that what it means to thrive can carry multiple connotations, then we might say that a successful ecological system is one in which all partner species are maximized in their ability to thrive. And we can think of agriculture as an ecological system, and humans as a keystone species to that system. Hold that thought. We're going to come back to that in a moment. For humans at least, and possibly a few other species, we generally want to ensure those circumstances for our family and our community. That is, our people. But things get a little tricky on two fronts. First, how do we define family and community? And second, how willing are we to recognize, value, and respect the interest of those who are not in our family or community to also thrive? Let's consider family. Do we mean the immediate unit of those we live with, which may or may not resemble the typical nuclear family, or something broader? I used to ask my students to draw their families, and what continually amazed me was both the diversity of configurations they would draw and also the commonalities of the roles included. Some of them had a mom, a dad, themselves, and a sibling. Some of them had just one parent. Or they might represent divorce by drawing their parents on opposite sides of the page, maybe even with a current spouse. Some had two moms or two dads. Some had grandparents, or aunts and uncles, or cousins, or step-siblings, or friends who were so close they might as well be family. Usually at least a third of them would include pets. The families were as diverse as the students in the room, but in several years of doing this activity, no one ever drew a relationship where others couldn't go, yeah, I can see how that person could be family. Even the pets. My point is not to arrive at some agreed-upon definition or even to have a firm boundary. What I want us to be clear about is how, where, and when we draw that boundary. Essentially, we're asking, who is included? It's a similar question for community, though the stakes are not the same. Community could be limited to family in its most narrow sense. It could include our church or religious body, significant social groups we're a part of, friends, or maybe even some acquaintances, our town or city, our county, our region, our state, our nation, and even at its widest, our world. Levels of community can be nested and overlapping, and how we define it may even depend on the context, and that's okay. Understanding who is included in our community is important for addressing that second question. For those we do not see as part of our community, what allowances and accommodations will we make as they also pursue their quest to survive and thrive? Put another way, if surviving and thriving is a zero-sum game, and I'm not saying it is, but let's just pretend to simplify things, how do the needs and aspirations of different groups and individuals get balanced? If we define our community in the broadest sense, the world or all of humanity, then it stands to reason we must seek ways for everyone to survive and thrive. In its noblest sense, this is what sustainability is really about. But most of us do not define community so broadly, if for nothing else, out of practicality. And so then the ethics of the situation matter. If we believe that other groups have a right to pursue such a goal also, we will avoid doing things that impede on their ability to survive and thrive, even if that means limiting ourselves in some capacity. Now, in an ideal world, these other groups are doing the same and everything works in a sort of dialogue. But of course, we don't live in an ideal world. And in more extreme cases, there are those who want to actively inhibit the ability of, quote, outsiders to survive and thrive. Which brings us to an important consideration we must all face in our quest to survive and thrive. What is our ability to influence or accomplish such an outcome? And this is really a question of power. Now, back in my teaching days, I defined power as the ability to accomplish one's goals despite opposition from others. I would also put limits on that by focusing on legitimate mechanisms of power, such as those that didn't rely on charisma, force, coercion, violence, etc. But really, that's a false limit. Again, we do not live in an ideal world. The insurrection on January 6th of 2021 was a stark reminder that there are those who had very little qualms about using violence to accomplish goals. And the actions of politicians leading up to and since that day show that many have no issue coercing or forcing others to bend to their will. Democracy is very much in danger. Now, when we think about different levels at which we may define community, we can also start to see how our power relative to those different levels varies. Our ability to influence our friends and immediate social groups is likely greater than our ability to influence outcomes in our state, even less so at the level of nation. And to the quest of surviving and thriving, the further out we draw that boundary, the less our ability to ensure such outcomes, at least for most of us. Here's a simple example.
If done right, in just my own backyard, I might be able to meet the bulk of my food needs for myself and my family, and maybe even have a little bit left over to trade, sell, or even give away. I might give the surplus to friends. I might sell it at a neighborhood farm stand or even a farmer's market, or I might give it to a local soup kitchen. In all of those cases, I might be contributing in some small way to the survival and well-being of others, but it is likely only a modest contribution at best. In the grand analysis, I'm likely not doing much toward the outcomes of my state, nation, or world. Now, that doesn't mean that it's not important, just that I should be mindful of limits. This ability to help our family and community and ourselves thrive, or at minimum survive, is shaped by two factors. First, our innate, and I'm putting quotes around that, capabilities, skills, and resources. And then second, the physical and social systems of which we are a part. In part 3, we will explore the relationship between these different spheres. We all find ourselves with a certain set of skills, capabilities, and resources. Some of these might be natural, such as height, physical strength, musical aptitude, mathematical prowess. But even most of those natural or innate things have to be developed. We work out to build our strength. We practice so that our musical skills become better. The more math problems we solve, the better we become at math. Seriously, if you tell yourself you're bad at math, try doing more math, and you'll probably get better at it over time. This is just a small sampling, and there are a lot of things I'm leaving out for now, but what I want you to see is that each of us has certain things we bring to the table. But I also want us to see that what we bring to the table is not just about our own natural or innate capabilities. Yes, that is absolutely a part of it. I am not trying to diminish that. But our abilities are also shaped by the opportunities presented to us in life and how we respond, or don't respond, to those opportunities. We are always participating in something bigger than ourselves. There are broader social forces in the world that influence our lives. Sometimes they're easy to see, and sometimes we have to do a little digging. But if we want to understand how best to survive and thrive in this rapidly changing world, we need to have at least a basic grasp of these broader forces, how they interact with each other, and how we interact with them. This is really the heart of what Erving Goffman called the sociological imagination, the ability to put our personal experiences in the context of broader social forces. Put very, very simply, you are more influenced by the world around you than you often think you are. In my experience, some people have a hard time accepting this truth. So I hope you'll bear with me as I work to unpack that. And even if you don't totally buy it by the end of this video, keep coming back, because I will return to this theme regularly, and hopefully it will make more sense with time. We as individuals exist in a dynamic relationship with a variety of social systems. Some of these social systems are cultural, the norms, mores, values, and customs that a society shares. We generally pick a lot of this up in childhood, though cultural systems are constantly evolving and influencing us throughout our lives. Yes, even if we personally might be called countercultural, we still exist in relationship to that dominant culture. Other social systems are what we might call social institutions. Simply put, social institutions are the sets of arrangements, such as roles and organizations, that add order and predictability to our lives. This includes things like family, education, religion, economy, the state or government, and even the media. It includes everything from organizational practices to public policies and laws. Social institutions are patterns of social life that are not reducible to individuals and are durable enough to withstand the whims of individuals who would change them. Now, that doesn't mean they can't be changed, just that they typically don't change just because one person says they should. Now, we'll talk about change later. What I want you to hold in mind is that these social forces both enable and constrain the choices and opportunities before us. But it's not just social systems that matter. Our physical environment also offers certain opportunities and constraints. How do our actions as a society influence the physical world around us? And how does the physical world influence what we do as a society? How does the physical environment impact the choices we as individuals make? And how do our individual actions impact the physical world around us? So to sum it up, our social systems and our physical environment offer certain opportunities and constraints to us. Physical and social systems impact one another, and we as individuals have certain skills, capabilities, and resources, and we also impact and are impacted by both social systems and physical systems. All three of these arenas exist in a dynamic relationship with one another. We're going to keep returning to this theme in different ways in future videos, but I think that's enough theory for now, because that helps us turn to the question at the heart of all this. Given what's going on, how do we ensure our ability to survive and thrive?
Whether we mean individually or societally, we need to be building processes and systems that are sustainable. Now, it seems like everyone is jumping on the sustainability bandwagon these days, which leads to a little bit of, shall we say, false advertising, or at the very least, a bit of murkiness about just what we mean when we use the term sustainability. Put simply, whether we're talking about food or something else, sustainable practices are those that meet the needs of the present without compromising the ability of future generations to meet their own needs. In a sustainable system, those practices can be maintained indefinitely without adverse consequences to the physical or social environment.
To help us gain a little more analytic traction, we can think of sustainability as straddling three distinct yet interrelated spheres. Sustainable systems are ecologically and environmentally sound, they are economically viable, and they are socially responsible. In short, sustainability is about the environment, of course, but it's also about people. Business circles sometimes refer to these arenas as the triple bottom line.
It's also helpful to think of sustainable practices and orientations as existing along some sort of continuum rather than being a dichotomy. It's not that something either is sustainable or isn't. It's better to think of practices as being more or less sustainable than others, depending on how well they align with the three pillars of sustainability. But we need to be careful. This is not about making compromises and trade-offs between these three different arenas. This is about trying to maximize all three simultaneously. So I'm going to walk through each of these arenas, giving most of my attention to how we as individuals might be more resilient in the face of these uncertain times we live in, but also giving occasional nods to how we might think of this on cultural or even institutional levels.
Modern industrial agriculture treats food production as a system of intense resource extraction. I'll unpack what's going on there in a future video, but for now, let's just take as a premise that the fact that it takes so much and gives back so little is what makes it unsustainable. Being ecologically sound means that our actions work in harmony with natural and physical systems, and a vibrant ecological system is one in which all participants in that system interact with, and in some sense both inhibit and benefit from, each other. This is nature at work. As different species attempt to eat, grow, reproduce, they are constrained or enabled by what's going on around them. These behaviors similarly constrain or enable other parts of the system. Call it the food chain, the circle of life, or whatever. A healthy ecological system is one in which these things are in balance, in a state not exactly of equilibrium, but perhaps more accurately of steady state. We might think of humans and hunter-gatherer societies as being especially enmeshed in such a system. We might also think of the development of agriculture as a part of the evolutional development of human beings. The idea is not so far-fetched. Plenty of species, especially animal species, modify their environment to make it more suitable for themselves. Other species adapt and evolve in response to this, and when it's maladaptive, usually something dies off. Consider how beavers may build a dam, birds may build a nest, carpenter bees bore into wood, or consider how bees use pollen to make honey, and in so doing aid the reproductive capacity of those plants. In this sense, then, agriculture is simply an adaptive evolutionary strategy of humans.
Michael Pollan talks about the evolutionary bargain of species like corn and apples. Corn, a special type of grass, threw in its evolutionary lot with humans as a partner species. Much how some plants rely on birds to eat a berry and spread the seed, so corn relies on humans through the mechanism of agriculture. Though this perspective runs the risk of placing too much anthropomorphic agency on plants and even other animals, it is a useful model for thinking about species interdependency in an ecological system. This doesn't just apply to corn. Numerous other plant, animal, fungal, and bacterial species are part of the bargain in some way. At the risk of giving more agentic potential than is due, we might think of participating species in such a system as existing on a continuum from incredibly dependent to willing and able to opportunistic, maybe even parasitic. On the one end are the domesticated plants and animals that we grow and raise. On the other are pests, weeds, diseases, and the like. In the middle may be things like fungal and mycelial networks, gut bacteria, and a host of beneficial species like ladybugs and bees and things like that contribute in some way to a system's vitality or perhaps help keep pests and other predators out, but that may or may not provide some product of direct benefit to humans. And perhaps this invites us to think about community in some broad new ways as well. Seeing agriculture through the lens of an ecological system shows us that the evolutionary bargain cuts multiple ways, and humans are a keystone species in making it work. Maybe think of it as a giant interspecies treaty on mutual cooperation. However we think of it, what matters is that we fully understand and appreciate the critical role that all participating species play in making the system work. And that means understanding what each species gets out of the bargain, what each species contributes, and what each species most wants, which is usually linked to what it gets, at least when things are balanced. So what do humans want out of agriculture? Well, we want to eat, and ideally eat well. So what is it that we get out of agriculture? Ideally, we get food to eat. But we might also get other benefits, such as beauty, or better health through things like cleaner air and water, or physical activity, or maybe even a sense of accomplishment and satisfaction. The question we rarely consider is what we contribute to this bargain. We consume the food from the garden or farm, but what do we give back? In a healthy and robust system, our contribution is this. We are the brains of the operation. We're the control system, the managers, the stewards. We are the ones tasked with understanding what characteristics will best help all of the participating species to thrive, and then once we understand that, doing what we can to maximize those conditions. The best agricultural systems are the ones that work with nature. Now, working with nature doesn't mean letting nature run its course and go wild. It means that we recognize that each contributing species has certain conditions that it most desires and is best adapted to, will participate in certain ways if we meet those conditions, and might even contribute to the benefits or possibly detract from the benefits of other species, depending on how they are configured. So what we need to do in working with nature is understand what those species are best adapted to and most want and need, and then do what we can to maximize that for all of the different species that participate in this process. Modern industrial agriculture has taken the brain trust role that humans are supposed to play and warped it into an extractive, even parasitic relationship. It focuses on the species that give direct benefit to humans, but at the expense of others that really should be part of the bargain. This reduction in scope has consequences. For decades now, it has allowed people, particularly Americans, to provide abundant food for themselves at fairly low cost with an incredible amount of variety. The problem is, it can't last. Industrial agriculture is a maladaptive strategy that eventually will fail. And when it does, many people are going to have a much harder time providing food for themselves. This will be compounded by impacts from climate change. Current expectations are that our world will be radically different by the end of this century. We're already seeing some of those impacts. Impacts, by the way, which were predicted in the middle decades of the 20th century and which were known in the mainstream since the late 1980s. So there is really nothing here, at least as far as it relates to climate change, that's really a surprise, or it shouldn't be a surprise. So living sustainably means providing food for yourself, your family, and even your community that works in harmony with physical and natural systems. It means taking on that role as brain trust steward as much as possible. In a hegemonic sense, economic vitality is often understood to mean profitable. Worse, much of our modern socio-political system is built on maximizing and prioritizing this aspect above all others. This is how we get so out of whack with natural and physical systems, and how much social inequality is allowed to flourish. This is the heart of unbridled capitalism. I want us to reframe economics to mean more than just money. Economics refers to how we utilize the various resources available to us. That could mean money. In the modern age, that's how we typically define it. But it could also mean access to land on which to produce food and other needed supplies. Our knowledge, skills, and abilities, which we can use repeatedly for our own benefit or for others, be that as a gift or as trade. Our time, and this is a resource we all get evenly, though other forces in our world may constrain or enable how we use it. Access to material inputs we cannot generate or sustainably extract ourselves. And outputs we might be able to offer up to others, both within and outside of our community, and both as charity and as trade or sales. In a totally closed-loop system, the last two don't exist. And while I think we should be aiming for a closed-loop system in principle, in reality, a fully closed-loop system may be impractical, undesirable, and possibly impossible. The only way that a fully closed-loop system becomes practical or even conceivable is if our broader environmental and socio-political systems have just collapsed so completely that not much else is even reasonable at this point. But if that's the case, we're living in a post-apocalyptic nightmare, and that's kind of tough to fathom. And let's keep in mind, I'm a sociologist with an affinity for post-apocalyptic dystopian science fiction, so if it's something that I would have a hard time fathoming, that might be saying something. Anyway, we should be aiming to close the loop significantly, but we should also remember that we don't live in a vacuum. So if we're trying to live sustainably, then on an economic standpoint, that means that we are utilizing our resources as efficiently and wisely and judiciously as possible so as to provide for ourselves, our family, and our communities. Plus, you can't eat money. Well, you could, but I don't think it tastes very good, and it probably wouldn't digest very well either. While my first priority is to myself and my family, I think we have a moral duty to think about community also. And this moral obligation extends to the furthest we can reach with community. Put another way, it is not good enough to simply say, well, I'll get mine while I can and to hell with anyone else. There are many people who seem to think this way. And such a view is short-sighted at best, and I think immoral at worst. At bare minimum, being socially responsible means not doing things that inhibit or limit other people's ability to survive and to thrive. This means thinking about the consequences of our actions on others, those outside of our closed loop. That means also thinking about how I vote. Are the people and policies I support going to be enhancing or limiting the ability of other people to also meet this core goal? So yes, this means that a truly sustainable system is also one that is deeply concerned with civics and politics. This also means that merely passively avoiding harm to others is pretty weak sauce. Granted, we can't impact everything, especially the further out we extend our view, but that's also why I talked about power earlier. And that shouldn't excuse us from trying where appropriate. Of course, remember our discussion of resources. You may not have time or energy to take on every problem, so choose your battles wisely. We need to be thinking in terms of broad coalitional politics that help move everyone into a better position, especially those that start from fewer opportunities. Also remember that our democratic systems are showing signs of failing. In truth, our democracy may never have been as robust as we've been led to believe it is. We like to tell ourselves that we're the freest nation on earth, whatever that means. But there are a lot of metrics that show that we aren't quite as hot as we like to think ourselves to be. Most powerful? Perhaps. Militarily, economically, diplomatically? Yeah, probably. But power does not equal democracy. Power does not equal freedom. Power does not equal in the right. Power must be tempered by morals and ethics. So, the system is fucked, looking to stay that way for a while, perhaps even get worse. Don't let that stop you from doing what is right. We have an obligation to love our neighbor as ourselves. It is incredibly ironic that with so many people claiming America to be a Christian nation, that this fundamental tenet of Christianity is so often forgotten or just ignored. So let that principle guide what you do. Be proactive, even if doing so feels meaningless. Sometimes we fight the good fight not because we expect to win, but because the fight just needs to be fought. This perhaps shows us another way in which a totally closed-loop system is really not desirable, because it allows us to ignore the needs of our neighbor and the obligations that we may have to those around us. This idea of civic engagement is so important, in fact, that don't be surprised if it turns up as the topic of many other videos. Some of them might not even have anything to do with food, but I will argue that they have everything to do with sustainable living. So as we seek to meet the physical, emotional, and intellectual needs of ourselves and our families, as we try to maximize our well-being, joy, and growth, we should aim to do so in ways that work in harmony with our physical and natural systems, that are adaptive to the changes and challenges coming our way, that make wise use of the various resources of time, talent, and treasure available to us, and that seek to support others in their efforts along these lines. So, what should you expect in the videos to come? Well, the core idea is to think through questions of sustainable living and how we do that in the modern age. So there's going to be a mix of stuff, and I'm probably going to organize it using those three spheres of individual, social, and physical. Some of it will be broad conceptual stuff, some of it will be kind of autoethnographic as we think through all of this using my own experiences and learning through these things. Some of it will be looking at the intersection between these things. So a variety of topics. I'm going to do my best to keep it organized. I am definitely open to suggestions and ideas and questions as this develops, so leave comments, drop me a line, anything you want to do here. We will figure it out together. I believe that a better world is possible. Whether we are able to pull back from the brink or topple over the edge and have to rebuild, I believe it is possible for all of us to find ways to survive and even thrive in the Anthropocene.